Guenther, warm welcome to Startup Grind. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me today.
And we are really excited to dive into Chinese AI models, like one of the fastest moving spaces globally right now.
Yes, I have to say that actually, when we first discussed this, it was actually a pretty interesting topic because this has been evolving so quickly, and so many people have been so curious about what's been going on. Especially we hear about it ever since the days of DeepSeek, and yet to this day, people still tend not to know too much about the landscape over there. And it was just something that just so happened, a coincidence, really, that my paths do overlap with both the Western models and also with the Chinese models. And so, thanks again for inviting me today.
Yeah, and it's great to have you here. And it is part of Startup Grind's Global AI Month. And we thought it was a great way to invite you and to learn all these opportunities. But before we jump into those topics, maybe you can give a brief introduction of yourself.
For sure. Just going to share my screen here. Just had a few really basic pictures here. So just a little bit about me. So I'm founder and CEO of Sigtica, which is a document intelligence company. We operate primarily in Hong Kong and in Canada, but we've also been working with partners in the US and also about to start some of our partnerships in mainland China as well. And so there's a picture of me on the left here from an event actually in Beijing. I was actually at the Baidu conference, the developer conference last month to specifically talk about some of the applications of the LLMs that they've been working on and how we can apply it to overseas projects. But we primarily work with universities. And so on the right here in the top corner, that's me giving a talk on cultural preservation with AI at Harvard. We've been working with them on understanding and using AI to protect rare books and to somehow integrate AI into their workflow in order to preserve these kind of cultural relics in different languages. This primarily Korean, Japanese, Chinese, but also in the bottom here, I also have my talk at the University of Toronto, where we've been also working with scholars there on Latin and Old English. And so pretty much my background comes from a interdisciplinary background. I actually studied applied economics, but I ended up doing AI mainly because of the applied statistics and kind of going through that route into AI. And so I kind of understand the clients that I deal with, which are primarily like humanities, non-technicals, but at the same time, I also have some understanding of the technical aspect. And so I kind of sit in the intersection of various things. And I think that's how Sigtica started. And that's how Sigtica is growing as well, is that it seems like this space is a relatively new space for both North America and Europe and is growing. There's been increasing interest in the last half a year about this, but really AI can be applied to multiple places. And this is just our little space, our little vertical in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, I agree with you when it comes to the languages. I mean, we had an interview this summer with Larix from Kenya, where AI can preserve languages that otherwise would disappear.
Yeah. And so just really quickly here is also that some of our workflows are really just we take classical, say, hard copies, they get scanned, and then somehow they want to put them into some sort of database. And that whole process can now, of course, be done with large language models. But the challenges are really in the subtleties. And I think that kind of feeds into what we want to talk about today as well, is that actually different models do have different strengths. And depending on the context, sometimes it's better to use a Chinese model, sometimes it's better to use a Western model, and also cases where they're pretty much the same as well. So that's kind of my angle in sharing my experience today. So
Yeah, and then sort of when we got introduced, I mean, you have experience across both Chinese and Western AI ecosystems, which sort of gives you that strength to see. Now, if we take the first question, like, how would you describe the current landscape of the Chinese AI models? Who are the main players that we should know about?
yeah, so this is pretty interesting. So we just have a kind of like a small history lesson here. Back in November last year, I checked this because I thought it was around February, but actually it was a little earlier. In November last year, 2023, DeepSeek open sourced their model, right? And this was like a huge thing because prior to that, we had a few other ones like Llama from Meta, and I think we also had Gemma from Google as well, from DeepMind, Google DeepMind, but really nothing that was as substantive as DeepSeek in terms of its metrics. It was able to match GPT at the time. I think at the time the most popular model was I think GPT-4 or 3.5 around that area, and it was able to do pretty good stuff on a budget, right? And that was when it all started. And so the reminder is it's only been 1 year or less since then. And since then, I think even Sam Altman had said that DeepSeek was at one time the most downloaded app in the world. And so I think what that did was that placed DeepSeek on the map. And since then, that has also not only brought more attention to Chinese AI, but it's also kind of spurred growth in the Chinese AI space to also have pressure to open source too. And so in the landscape, obviously we have DeepSeek, and then we also have a few other ones that I think people may not be as familiar with. Let me share this one. There's a Moonshot.ai. Moonshot AI is another very serious AI company in China based in Beijing. And they recently also just open sourced their model as well in the same way that DeepSeek did. And they are known for an extremely large context window. So they claim up to 2 million tokens. And the point of that is that they're really focused on more like enterprise solutions in like finance and legal, where you really have to read very long documents, but you want to squish that into a context window so that you can ask it questions without chopping it up. And so I would say that apart from DeepSeek, Moonshot is, or Kimi, which is their product, is a very serious contender. I will get into the details later. And then also another one, which I think few people have heard of, is this one, bigmodel.cn or Jipu. Actually, this player has actually been around in China for quite a while now. It's just that they've been a little bit more low key and not as popular for consumers. But again, they're really targeting the enterprise landscape in China. And so they support all the multimodal content that you would expect. So they've gone way beyond just text. Whereas DeepSeek, even to this day, is primarily very text based. But Jipu is actually one that's also in the new space, just like everybody else, doing video, doing audio, as well as text. And then we have another one from ByteDance. So that one actually, you really got to use the app for that one. But ByteDance is in the space, but again, that one is not available overseas, not easily. We actually checked today, and that's a bit unfortunate, but it's actually a very popular one in mainland China. And I think I have to mention this one, which is QWen or Tianwen in Chinese. Essentially, literally what it means in Chinese is like you can ask it 1,000 questions. And it's funded by Alibaba. Alibaba is a really big name in China. Pretty much, if you think about cloud services, Alibaba Cloud is the biggest cloud provider in China. It even sponsored the Olympics. So it's really big at scale. And so they have the scale to be able to provide these kinds of large language services for enterprise. Again, Qwen is a very enterprise focused service, but they have some really handy tools and they do stuff like video generation, deep research, and especially deep research, I would say, is very comparable to what you would expect on, say, ChatGPT, OpenAI kind of services. So I would say that if I was physically in China and I needed to look for something that was comparable to ChatGPT, I'd probably say that Qwen is like a really good start because it's bilingual. It has a good interface for English and for Chinese. So you really get kind of like the full experience, even if you cannot read Chinese because it's always an English version. It's also available overseas. Its latency is pretty good, like loading it in Canada and Europe, wherever else. And it is relatively consistent in its delivery of the content. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you say, because we're going to come back to a couple of questions. One is, of course, the difference of download model and having it on your own hardware versus using the web version that is hosted back at the user or the company. But as you say, many of these models are enterprise products. And of course, ChatGPT, there is a business version, there is an enterprise version. But sometimes we think it's more sort of all these consumers. But the way that I hear from you is that, correct me if I'm wrong, that they are really building these enterprise models because enterprises in mainland China is really going to use them.
Yeah. So if we were to compare and contrast kind of the way that the West evolved and the way that the Chinese AI scene is evolving, I think DeepSeek was the first where it was really to consumer. It was really, okay, everybody in the West knows ChatGPT. You can ask it anything. It was getting a lot of traction at college. College students were using it. And so people in China were using DeepSeek for the same purpose, asking it, things about my homework or about notes and all that. But then really where the investments were really taking place were really in these products for enterprise, mainly because there's a large demand for enterprises in China to be able to implement LLMs as soon as possible because they often compete on costs. They want efficiency, they want productivity. And also there's a joke in China, which is everything is China speed. Everything just runs faster in China. That's kind of how they think. And so they're thinking, well, if this is a good tool, we want to be able to have that as soon as possible and integrate it in our services so that we can improve efficiency. And because there's so much scale in China, the supply, there's lots of supply chains and lots of scale. So then there's also a lot of returns from doing that. And their focus tends to be more on being able to deliver at a lower cost at scale. Volume tends to be their business model rather than like, very high precision for doing things. So that's I think the background behind why they would target enterprise in the first place. So
Now, enterprises, I mean, of course, consumers pay money on subscription fees, but enterprises is something kind of say completely different, but it is different. And there is a maybe longer commitments also when you have business to business or business to sort of enterprise customers. And for our friends here in the call who are not from the region, I mean, I often say when it comes to time, we count it in with a stopwatch. That's how we count time in Sweden. They say, oh, we do it next week. And it does make a difference. So,
yeah.
so I think you touched a bit on it, but I mean, how would you compare these models to OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google's? I mean, how similar are they?
Yeah. So actually, just so as I'm linking the two together from enterprise and also how similar they are, the first thing that you'll notice on Quen's website is that there's nothing about pricing. There's no premium, there's no upgrade, nothing. It's literally there's like try chat and there's only the chat, and the chat looks the same as the other ones. But because actually, in fact, this was something that came up a lot when I was talking to people who were trying to integrate it in just regular office work, was they wanted a premium, like, should we buy a premium subscription so that we have a stable supply of Quen and all that? And actually, it just doesn't really exist because, again, the focus is really more on enterprise than it is on consumers. And so far, actually, in fact, I've never hit the limit, but they don't really explicitly talk about the limit. But however, there is a caution here, and this goes into the pricing part, is you have a smaller context window for the chat version of Quen, which is much smaller than, say, ChatGPT. And that's because, again, they're optimizing it for low cost. And they've noticed based on their past data that most people would ask it very short questions or upload very short documents. And so therefore, they're optimizing, saying, okay, well, we noticed that we can provide it for free, great for consumers, but we're only going to do it at this context window. And if you want anything beyond that, you really need to get the developer version and kind of build it yourself, kind of thing. And then kind of bring that into how that compares to the Western models, is that it really goes back to what are you using it for? And so OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google, they're also doing, kind of like general use large models, right? And so when you ask it questions in English, it's able to answer it very well. If you ask it questions in Chinese, though, it sometimes fails to understand certain context. And I think that's really where the models in China are optimized for, is that they're optimized for answering Chinese specific content and Chinese specific questions. And it's for a different market, right? And they've really been hyper focused on the China market rather than the kind of the excluding China market, the global market. And so that is probably the first difference that any user, even if you ask the question in English, you'll notice that sometimes the results, depending on what you ask, may be very tailored to a certain audience. I always tell my friends that language actually might matter a little bit, but actually wouldn't matter too much if you're very detailed in your prompt. You can ask Quen a very detailed English question and it can answer it. It can fully understand it. And then I could ask it to switch to Chinese or another language, French or whatever, and it would be able to do that pretty well too. So I would say that is the primary difference. And so this also goes to kind of how it was produced with the training data. So because they're focused on different things, the training data will often behind the scenes, they won't tell you this, but what we know just from looking at it, from like based on our experience, is that clearly the Chinese models are better at understanding like the way of written Chinese. So if you get a document in Chinese and you would like to look at it in English or Swedish or another language, then you would ask Quen to translate it for you. And depending on which model you use, if it's Quen or DeepSeek or whatever, you might get some subtly different kinds of content, and that's coming from the training data set.
Yeah, but the point also, of course, is that as we kind of live in a global economy, using the best AI models, the best tools for the markets that we are in. And one of the points that we had on the invite for this event is also if you have a team in mainland China, which models are then available for them to do their work. But you kind of touched upon this. I mean, from your perspective, because it's less than a year, what is driving China's rapid progress in AI development right now?
Yeah, so I think at first it was why DeepSeek came out was to kind of put China on the map. Before that, China wasn't even on the map. I would say that really, okay, what we've been hearing recently, and this is like literally as of the last few months from these AI companies, that they're really interested in expanding overseas. This is something that they've been telling me even like last week when I was at some conferences, is that they want to expand overseas, but they also realize that they're having challenges because of the geopolitical situation. And so they've been thinking about rebranding a lot of their content. But I would say that competition there's two levels of competition here in terms of like what's driving China's rapid progress here. I think one is Western competition. So they're seeing, okay, all these great models coming out from OpenAI, Anthropic, Gemini, and they want to match that level in China so that Chinese consumers and enterprises can benefit from the same things. But I think there's also a lot of competition that's happening internally. So if we, and we'll get into this later, is really if you look at like the open sourcing, right? DeepSeek did it first. At that time, Sam Altman was surprised, right, about DeepSeek doing this. But then after that, all these other ones, Kimi, Ernie, a whole bunch of other Chinese models followed suit and did the same thing. And so there's a bit of competition within China to say, okay, well, if you're open sourcing, I'm also going to open source too. I need to be able to match you. I want to be part, I want to have a seat at the table as well. And of course, that's good for consumers and developers because now we can just choose whichever model we would like to have. I think there's also, and this might happen in the future, in the next year or two, is that there also could be a slowing down of this. Because now people might feel like we don't have an incentive to put so much money into training the next version of the model because we're just going to open source it anyway and people may not use it and we may not benefit as much from it. But that's, I would say that that's at least 1 or 2 years away and we'll probably still expect to see very quick iterations like on these companies in the next few months.
Yeah, and I guess when it comes to the open sourcing part, is one to know that you are able to. In my case, it would I can download Llama. There's another one. Should I actually use it like that? It's kind of having somebody else to manage it for me. Of course, is make it easy, and also enterprises. I mean, not everybody. There is a difference. How big a team do you have? So I guess there are two parts of it. So when they decided, or as you said, DeepSeek was the first model that was open sourced, and it benefits everybody because you could try the model locally. Then you also have the web versions. So maybe you can kind of just quickly describe the difference of what happens when you actually want to use it on your machine versus the web version of DeepSeek, for example.
So after they open sourced all their models, where do you get these models? And usually there's this platform called Hugging Face. So this is a model, if you're a dev, you would understand this, but if you're not, it'd be good to kind of know what is like the platform that everybody's looking at when they look at like open sourcing, like, oh, QN just open sourced their next model. Where are they open sourcing it to? They're open sourcing it to this platform, Hugging Face. So this is something that, again, like I was talking to some devs in Shenzhen, and this is like their homepage. Like every day they just have this open, they're just refreshing it every day and seeing how many likes or how many forks are going on the platform. And so if we look down at the models, so Hugging Face is split into this models, there's spaces, there's data sets. Really what we care about are the models here, and these are the models that came out. And so if we look at just models, so these are all open source, right? Because it's out there. ZAI, that's the big model CN. That's again one that's a lesser known name, but they're also open sourcing as well. And then we also have DeepSeek as well, and a whole bunch of others that are on here. And so this is where you would get the most rawest form of the open source models is from Hugging Face. You can go in and you can follow, and because this is a platform where the companies would post their own stuff, and so they always have all sorts of information on the model that they're posting. So they'll have some statistics on how well it does, and then also some instructions on how to actually use it as well in that setting. How we actually do it in practice, like if we had, how we did it at least, was we would use a really popular tool called Ollama. It's literally, the icon is literally like a llama. And this is actually, I think, the name came from Llama because that was the original open, like large language model from Meta a long time ago, and it kind of set the standard for large language models. Ollama is really just a package which you can download, and you can install any of these models that Ollama has like in their repo. So what we did was, well, I should say my colleagues did, was that we had tried, for example, DeepSeek R1, which was the original one, which that was open sourced, and you can pull different sizes. So if you look carefully here, you'll see that there's multiple variations of DeepSeek here. So the B stands for billion. So for example, the smallest DeepSeek model would be 1.5 billion. It's a really small model. And you can also see it's a much smaller size. And so you can choose based on what you would like. You can choose either a small or a big model to be able to download onto your system. So pretty much step one is you would download Ollama, and then you would install it according to instructions, very straightforward. And then you would select which model you'd want, install that as well, and then you've got the setup on your computer. And once it's on your computer, you can actually unplug the internet and it will still work because you're not talking to DeepSeek anymore. You're now doing it directly on your computer. I think one caveat here, so it's good that we have DeepSeek on-prem and all that. One caveat though is that based on our experience is that there's a very big difference between the smallest model and the big model. So the pros are that the smaller model is cheaper to run because you can run it literally on your own computer. Whereas like the very large ones, you really need a server rack or a series of servers to be able to run that. But what we figured was actually that, at least in our line of work, it was actually more important to get a more intelligent model, which is larger, and just be okay with waiting. So depending on how much hardware you have, it will take longer to compute because if you have more GPUs and more CPUs, they'll just compute faster. But we were okay with waiting longer, but getting a better response. We actually tried the opposite as well, which was running a small model because we thought, okay, well, we don't really need to do anything complicated. We just needed to input some of these documents and understand it and then push back the JSON. And what we found was that actually it just could not understand the instructions very well. And so even if it was faster, it wouldn't help. It's not very helpful. And so that was kind of the trade-off. And that's something I think people should be aware of is that, yes, you have DeepSeek on-prem. You can run it on your own computer, completely isolated because it's open sourced. And yes, it's truly open sourced, but you do have to have a lot of engineering that goes into thinking about what is your use case and which one is better. And there's probably a lot of trial and error. So it's not just like you plug and play today and you're ready to go. It's most likely you're going to plug and play and still discover a lot of issues where you still have to integrate that with your workflow, which could take several months possibly, depending on the trial and error and the testing that you do.
Yeah, and I think it's so. Yes, I run a Llama on my M1 Mac laptop, and it does work. But yes, I do have to download the smallest models. But it's kind of also the point of just knowing that it works, so that when you choose the other version and host it somewhere else, you know why you are doing it and the benefits, the reasons for it. So it's amazing what you can do. And I guess, I mean, from me, I mostly tried to run models on Mac because of the way the memory works. But I guess, PCs are also a little bit tougher, but it's good to try. So we are, you said every DeepSeek open sourced, other model makers decided, well, if I want to have a seat at the table, I should also open source. So what can kind of Western companies learn from Chinese that open sourcing, the benefit or not benefit of it?
Yeah. So actually, I feel like that the whole concept of open sourcing was really a marketing move by these companies to be able to get no. Because you would have to imagine you have to spend millions of dollars to get no. And now all of a sudden, you've just given people a freebie. You've said, okay, you can use our model for free. But the caveat is, first of all, you're going to have your own hardware. So that already filters out a lot of people. And then you probably also need engineers who know what they're doing. So that filters out another amount of people. So really, at the end of the day, you can think of it as you get a lot of publicity, but then people will realize that we can't do it locally, like in a professional sense, in an industrial use sense. And so we're going to end up using your API anyway. So we end up using DeepSeek's own API. So that's kind of how they make back the money to some degree is that, okay, yes, we have publicity, but you realize this and then you buy our API. Now, this is actually another alternative story, which people think because DeepSeek is actually owned by a finance company and that they actually shorted NVIDIA stock in order to make the money when it came out. But like if you look back at Kimi, is like a pure AI company, and they're doing exactly the same thing. And I think it's for exactly the same reason. Now everybody knows about Kimi. They know about the 2 million context window, and they know that if you have very long documents that you need in the same context window to give you good results, go to Kimi. And that's what I would do today. But I wouldn't have known that if they had not open sourced. So I think that's a very good marketing trick on the China side. And how do Western companies learn from this? Actually, I feel like that it's less likely that Western companies would use this because they have other ways of marketing. And also, but I see how Western companies can benefit from open sourced content from China. So for example, I remember seeing on Bloomberg one day that the CEO of Perplexity was saying that they had taken the open source version of DeepSeek and they had trained it on certain content. So essentially, that was like already a shortcut, right? Before you had to build your own LLM. Now, essentially, you're taking an open source LLM, which is known to be quite good, but then you kind of tailor it to your audience. And that was because he was tailoring it to the American audience rather than the Chinese audience. And so he had to kind of reweight it. But then by doing that, now you offer a very good model on your platform to be able to do different things. And so it is a shortcut for Western startups, I think.
Yeah, and I think also what you earlier said about Hugging Face, that people are definitely checking it. I mean, you get known in the community, people try your product, and also the media that DeepSeek got thanks to because of NVIDIA's stock price going down because they open sourced it. Of course, that exposure was worth so much for them to be seen. So yeah, it's a smart move to do that. Now, if we look at the sort of, you showed Llama is one version. If somebody is outside mainland China right now and would like to access or integrate these models into their workflow, what should they do?
Okay, so right now I'm actually on a Canadian connection specifically to kind of look at the world from that side. And so I would say that if you're very interested in Chinese models, probably your best bet is to use Alibaba Cloud. So Alibaba Cloud has a model studio. So Alibaba Cloud is just like AWS or GCP or all these other ones, but primarily focused in China, but with also an international arm. So this is the international version. It literally says it in the corner there, and you can toggle between English and Chinese. So I'm looking at the English one right now. It actually offers a wide range of models, but if you look carefully, all these models are Quen models. So that's really the downside of using Alibaba Cloud is that it's very good for compute. It's also relatively reasonably priced, but you only have access to Quen models. You can actually also access, I'm going to show you another one, which is access to, say, Baidu's platform here. Let me just switch again. So this is Baidu's platform, literally aistudio.baidu.com. I can provide these links later. And so this is the so-called English version of their system. And yes, some of it is in English, but I think in this case, they haven't really fully integrated the English versions into their system. But this is available outside of China as well for the same purpose. Actually, Baidu does support multiple models, but I do think that language is still an issue here because this overseas campaign is still a relatively new thing for them. They've really only been thinking about this for the last probably like one to 2 months. But then that's definitely something to look out for is that in 6 months from now, you'll probably have something like a full English interface where you'll be able to use these models directly overseas. The thing is that if you're using their systems, there's a chance that they could route data through China, and that some people are more comfortable with that than others. But I would say that anywhere to start would definitely be Alibaba Cloud first, I would say, just to be fair.
No, and these are really good examples to start trying. So, I mean, another challenge, and we know that in regards to payments, mainland China is far ahead of a lot of other parts of the world with QR codes of payments and so on. But it's also a bit sometimes closed when it comes to being able to use foreign credit cards and so on. So, how, if somebody wants to use, not just to try, but to use the model on their hardware, how do you do with payments, etc.? Are there payment providers, etc., to go through to actually sign up for these models, or is that something we're going to find in the next when it's sold in like 1-2 months? Yes.
This is I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here, but when it comes to payments, though, so I literally tried this just to double check today because I did try it quite a while ago. Is again, Alibaba Cloud I think has the best system. You literally plug in your foreign credit card from wherever you're based, and it will work. I plugged in a Canadian one. I'm sure it would work for a European one or for an American one as well, and I was able to use the system no problem. I think though that there are other systems out there that don't have. Actually, I'm just going to share the DeepSeek one because I feel like we have to pay respects to the first that started it all. So this is DeepSeek's platform. So literally platform.deepseek.com. So in DeepSeek's platform, super simple. You have an API key. You can top up, and you'll notice here that you have an option for USD or Chinese. So for the Chinese one, you have Chinese payment options, but you also have a USD one. And so, and just a reminder that we're seeing this from a Canadian IP address. So this is a foreign perspective on the platform, and you're able to choose MasterCard or Visa and essentially plug in your number and you'll be able to get started, and you can then use your API keys, and also you can track your usage in US dollars as well. So I think for some of the ones that are very popular already, like outside of mainland China, so that would be DeepSeek and Quen from Alibaba, I think these ones payments wouldn't be a problem. And these are relatively good models already. The downside is that if you're doing on DeepSeek or you're doing on Alibaba, you're only using their stuff, right? You're only using the DeepSeek model or you're only using the Quen model. You can't kind of crisscross with the other ones. There's also Moonshot, which is Kimi, which is the latest one. This is the 2 million context window service. Again, they also have an option to be able to pay with card as well. What I found very interesting is they have this GST, which is actually a Canadian thing. Like in Europe, it would be VAT. But essentially, that means they're already registered with the tax authorities. They're ready for overseas top ups. And so I think what you see is that there are some that are very focused now on getting overseas. They want to be able to be globally recognized. That's DeepSeek, that's Quen, that's Kimi. Some other ones which are a little slower to the game, like ByteDance's Doubao, which is really kind of a little bit slow to the game there for good reason, because they didn't have a great experience with TikTok and all that. But I would say that this should be good enough to get started for any kind of Western company that wants to try it. I want to add one more thing here, though. It has to do with the pricing, because I feel like one thing that always comes up is, how much do they cost, right? Is it worth, like, why would people choose to use Chinese AI over Western AI products if Western AI products, some people might believe, are better or equal to or greater than? Well, I think the most important thing from our experience has been just good value for money, that you get pretty good responses on a wide range of industrial uses for a very fair price. And that's very consistent with their business model in China too, which is they want to be able to do volume in order to get scale. So that's why they do enterprise, is because they can get volume that way. And I think everybody kind of benefits from that as well, overseas as well. So here's a quick table that we put together just before this call, just to kind of get an idea as to like where the pricing stands in terms of both the Chinese and Western AI products. I feel like it's really important to look at context window as well when we're looking at pricing, because depending on what you use it for, that actually could be a bottleneck for you. If you're using it for just like, say, customer service chatting, or using it for, say, HR purposes. Nowadays, I hear about this all the time about how HR is really using a lot of AI in both the recruitment and paperwork and all that stuff. Or if you're using it for more like financial or legal, which would usually require a much bigger context window. And so then it might be cheaper, but it may not fit into the context window as well. And then in that case, it may not be a product for you. So just based on these numbers alone, I think it's pretty clear that DeepSeek is considered like a very reasonable, large model that you could use. But the downside is, of course, it's very text-based. It doesn't have the video or the audio. But if you are doing very text-based stuff, then definitely it's a good start. And Alibaba is more expensive. Now, I did hear that these prices are a little dated, that they might be changing this soon. Hopefully they will. But I guess what you're paying for that is probably just like more consistency in terms of the speed globally, because they have so much compute power globally. So I would say that's like probably like for starters, that would be an overview of like the pricing regarding if you cannot run on your own hardware, this would be a good place to start.
But so basically, the question that we answered in the invite, I mean, you can actually use these models, you can pay for them, and therefore you could provide them to your teams. Now, as you also said, I mean, I'm not saying that the ChatGPT, etc., is not good. Maybe if you're a manufacturing company, but I could imagine with all the manufacturing being done in mainland China for all products, that some AI models that are going to pop up there are going to be really good if you're optimizing production, because they just are made where the factories are. We are moving slowly. Always, we're going to get into the Q&A part, but sort of to a few questions just to wrap up. Sort of, what excites you the most about Chinese model generally?
So generally, I think I like to see myself as like a consumer in the whole landscape, right? Because, Western Chinese, whatever. I would say what excites me the most is that we now have more selection in the market because of competition, right? Whether it's West versus China, whether it's within China, whether it's within the West. When something new pops up, that's good for developers, that's good for consumers. We have more things to work with. And I think from at least my experience is that almost every product or solution that we do for our clients has always been actually a combination of different kinds of models, because we find that like certain things work just much better with fewer tokens. Like there's a lot of engineering that actually goes into the use of like large models. So there's almost never like a one size fits all, you just add one prompt and you're done kind of thing. Usually it's, especially if you're looking for a scalable solution, I mean, cost is an issue. Then you would think, okay, well, maybe DeepSeek is good for producing, as you said, like in the factories. Maybe all you need to do is you need to be able to recognize certain things that are coming out of the feeds from the logs. And DeepSeek is a very cheap way of doing that. Then that would be a great solution. But then, just like I said before, is that sometimes some models cannot really understand the nuances in your prompt. But then maybe that's something that, say, Claude could do very well, right? In which case, then we'll kind of mix it in with a Western solution as well, something that where we can kind of average out the pricing. I feel like that is actually a very big consideration for any kind of startup or even enterprise, is that like the prices do add up, even though they sound kind of cheap to begin with. And so if we lock into something, then we're going to end up with a huge bill. And so what makes me excited is that I can see that cost coming down now with more competition. As I think by next year, or at least from 2 years from now, we should be able to run a big model on our computers, I think.
Yeah, and of course that is nice, good chance to also start practicing that. Now, the one question that we always ask people nowadays is also, how do you keep up with everything that's happening in AI? Who do you turn to? And especially maybe also, where do you subscribe to if you want to have news from China when it comes to AI?
So I know this is going to sound kind of cheesy, but actually, in fact, my homepage is also Hugging Face. Um, and that's because I feel like that I want to be at the heart of everything. And Hugging Face is a global platform for like all the AI guys. So this is where the latest stuff will always come out. And then from this, I would usually, admittedly, actually, I do ask a lot of stuff to like say Gemini and ChatGPT to kind of keep me updated. That's actually a really important source. I feel like there's no single source unless if like unless if it was Hugging Face. I feel like that's always like my first stop, simply because I want to know like this is like literally like the cutting edge. Like this is where people would post it, and so I want to be the first to know when it comes out. Apart from that, I would say I actually do regularly check the blogs of all the teams of all the AI guys. So for example, like I would follow Google's Gemini's blog like literally on a daily basis just to see what they're working on, or DeepMind, which is obviously related, and all these. And that's usually how I get my first line of like latest tech news. And then just going to conferences and talking to people. I feel like just chit chatting with people over Google Meet actually would be super helpful in just understanding things. So, but yes, Hugging Face number one, I would say. Yeah.
And I love that. Now, you mentioned it. Okay, so before we sort of move to Q&A, how do people get in touch with you?
Yes, so you can add me on LinkedIn or send me an email. I'm always happy to chat about anything, really, anything AI or application of AI. That's something that I've always been enthusiastic. I feel like I have so much to learn from the community. So,
And we learned so much from you today. Guenther, it's been amazing having you here at Startup Grind during our AI month. And we learned so much, and we're going to move on to the Q&A part.